Hello and welcome to the second ever bonus episode of The Dive Down, a Magic the Gathering podcast for the casual spike, focused on the latest decks, trends, and strategies in Modern. My name is Stanislav, here in Chicago, and with me on the line from Denver, Colorado, it's the seasoned pyromancer, Shane Beeps.
Stan, it's been too long. I'm glad to see you again to record the second bonus episode, my dude.
Also with us here in Chicago, the Soulherder, Dave Harbarker.
I like the chance pretending we didn't just record another episode before this.
How dare you?
I'm pulling the curtain back, guys. This is Dive Down After Dark time. Bonus episodes. We're doing them after we do the main episodes.
Yeah, making our partners mad at us bonus episodes.
Wife equity blown. Market
Gotta spend
crashed.
it somewhere.
Yeah.
You know, it's got very low utility rate. You can't eat it. So
Is that how you measure things?
Last but not least, it's the Frostwalk Bastion, Zach Culhan.
I'm frosty. I'm chilly. I'm cold. But I'm hot for Modern Horizon.
We said it last time and we're going to say it again. Huge thanks to the patrons in the Dive Down Nation for helping us reach the stretch goal that allows for bonus episodes. We appreciate...
Oh, does it allow for it, or does it force our hand?
It demands it.
It
With an
demands
iron
it.
fist, it slams and says, "Tonight, you will be up very late, and you will record, and you will laugh."
Whether you're twisting our arm or politely voting on topics that we're thinking about, we appreciate every one of you and every one of our listeners every week.
Yeah, and if you are listening to this, you're not a patron, and you're into what we're doing, feel free to join the patron. You get to vote on what we're doing. You get to get some cool swag. Patreon.com/thedivedown.
And if you'd like to support us a different way, you can go to manatraders.com and enter code THEDIVEDOWN when you try out their excellent MTGO and paper rental service to get 10% off your first 3 months of rentals.
So this week, we thought it'd be fun to revisit our Modern Horizons grades from episodes 24 and 25. And look at what we got right, maybe some areas where we fell a bit short, and maybe thought some cards weren't that good and they turned out being pretty okay. The impact of Modern Horizons has been really significant, and like I just said, not in the ways that we'd expected. So there are some definite clear sleeves in Modern Horizons, Urza, Force of Negation, and the lands, the Horizon lands as we call them. But a lot of cards have had a really big impact and have made really huge waves, and there are things that we just kind of overlooked or thought that really wouldn't show up anywhere.
Yeah, and so it's fun to laugh about where we messed up, right? But I think it's more interesting to do this in order to improve everyone's card evaluation skills, right? So
I mean, this is Dive Down After Dark, so we're more interested in laughter than homework.
that's a good
But sure.
And it's a good way for us to take a look at the format on the whole right now, look at why certain cards are maybe more or less successful than people may have expected from Horizons. Of course, with this as a bonus episode, we don't have a breakdown, we don't have a wind down. We're just going to give you as much content about Horizons as we can in the time we have allotted for this. So, you want to get into this, guys? You ready?
Yep.
So Dave, you messed up at A, which is off the bat. You made a pretty big whiff. You want to talk about that?
Yeah, I got an F and on A, basically. So the first card we're going to talk about today is Arcum's Astrolabe, which is a snow artifact, and it costs a single snow mana.
Un snow.
And here's what the text reads. It says, when Arcum's Astrolabe enters the battlefield, draw a card. 1, generic, tap, add 1 mana of any color.
Seems okay. Seems fine.
Yeah, it does seem fine. Turns out it's better than fine.
Yeah, it looks pretty broken to me, actually.
Turns out it got banned today in Pauper. Actually. Didn't see that coming. Forgot that Modern Horizons cards were available for Pauper to use too, but not that that's our... We're going to get that on the Pauper down later.
Paw Patrol.
The Pauper Patrol. So look, I think this is the card that I misevaluated the most on the spoiler set list. As part of the reason I wanted to talk about it is because it's crazy the effects that this card has had on multiple different formats. In Modern, it's led to a number of different decks being able to not worry about mana quite as much as they were before, and their mana fixing. It's made it a little easier for certain styles of decks and types of decks to get around Zach's favorite card, Blood Moon.
How dare you steal my bet? How dare you?
I know. I'm really sorry about it. And it's even enabled, been a huge part of like enabling the egg style strategy in Urza. I think when you really look at it, the thing that I really messed up personally, because some of my co-hosts were a little bit more positive on this card than I was, is that I ignored one of my cardinal rules of modern card evaluation, which is recognizing the massive gap between something that costs 2 CMC and something that costs, and the same card costing 1 CMC.
Yeah.
We all know that Lightning Strike isn't playable in Modern, right? But Lightning Bolt is a staple.
Ooh,
And that's really the difference between Prophetic Prism and Arcum's Astrolabe, is just that 1 CMC makes it a totally playable staple and somewhat abusable card. And boy, do I feel bad about missing this one, because I really, if I had just kind of followed some of the heuristics that we've written as a group, I think that I would have done better nailing it.
For me, I knew this card was playable in Scred. And I literally, I saw this card, I went, oh my goodness, Scred has like the 1-drop it needed. Like Mind Snow can filter mana, it's opened so many different gates. And it did, to a degree, where Scred began having like every other week 5/0 dump show ups. And that was fun, and that was cool for me. But then, like Dave said, it just allowed some decks to go, oh, hey, by the way, I have perfect mana all the time, and like I don't care about Blood Moon, because that red's actually going to be green for me on my turn. So what I saw as potential for my tier 3 deck to get a little more competitive actually turned out to create a new tier 0 in Modern. And I, for one, love Urza and hope my family is safe.
I mean, it's a 1 mana card that replaces itself. It's an artifact, and it fixes your mana. Like, how did we miss this, right?
I called it an egg but better, but I guess I didn't realize what that could mean on a much better scale.
I think we didn't know where it went.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing is, but does it need a home? It's just a cheap artifact that replaces itself.
It's Snow, and I think Snow was previously caught up in this sort of like mythos that like Scred was the only Snow deck and Snow was too hard. But we've seen with Prismatic Vista, especially allowing people to fetch for Snow lands easier, there are some decks that run this that also only run basics. So you have this card fixing your mana and your land just kind of impervious to hate. So Blood Moon is pushed back on 2 fronts. I'm not crying, you're crying.
Brutal.
My review of this card really cracks me up, wherein I was a believe minus, and I wrote that this is the type of card I'd defer to Zach to evaluate, which couldn't even trust him there.
Oh, come on. I said sleeve.
I did account for a couple things, that it replaces itself and that it's a relevant permanent type. But I didn't think it would ultimately get there, because when I read this card, I thought it gets you down on mana. And the one little caveat was that maybe the right deck won't care about that mana disadvantage. But it turns out that none of the decks really care about that, since the mana fixing isn't actually a mana disadvantage, not only because it replaces itself, but also because it basically serves the purpose of making one of your any other lands a 5-color land. So I think this is a good reminder to think a play pattern through, as well as appreciating a cantrip when evaluating certain cards that might seem kind of tricky at first.
Yeah, and I think the last bow I would tie on this is any card that is 1 mana cost that says draw a card on it, you should stop and take a look at. Exactly. When it comes to Modern, there's probably a home.
All right, let's talk about probably
card number 2.
I think our overall biggest whiff is our next
team?
card.
Okay.
Yeah, Aria of Flame.
Dave, again, you mess up.
2 and a red enchantment. It reads, when Aria of Flame enters the battlefield, each opponent gains 10 life. Oh no, gains 10 life, that stinks.
That's half your life total. That's so much.
But whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, you put a verse counter on Aria of Flame. It's got a little music note on it, little harp. Then it deals damage equal to the number of verse counters on it to target player or planeswalker. So we gave this 3 heaves and a believe question mark from our Zach, because he believed there is some jank there.
I called this card Believable Jank, which is, I think, technically not wrong.
I mean, I think what we really thought was that like casting the spells you needed to after casting this was just going to be nonsense. But at least I personally forgot just how good all these fast modern spells can be with their cantripping, with the direct burn in addition to them. You're just peeling through the deck and finishing people off when you play this card.
I'm going to quote Dave right now. It's like I forgot blue cards existed.
Yes, that's how I feel about it now. It's like I forgot Serum Visions and Opt existed.
What about Desperate Ritual? What about Pyretic Ritual?
What about them?
They also exist.
No, are we just naming magic cards?
Well, they trigger Aria of Flame.
Yeah. Turned out they didn't matter too much with this particular card in the home that it ended up in. Maybe someday. But yeah.
I think for me, what we should have done was the math in terms of how many spells it takes to win off of this, because
We did, though.
Yeah, we were like 4 spells.
No,
That seems
we did. It was
ridiculous.
like 4 spells to break even. 4 spells is way too many to break even. Like, I'm sure right now someone's like making a cut right now where they're putting that audio right here going, oh, the boys are wrong again.
I think in hindsight, you're right, Stan, where it's like, it almost seems like we didn't because it's so easy
Yeah.
to imagine like peeling through 4 spells in your deck. But it's like, oh, I just took turn 3 off. What, next I'm going to cast 4 spells?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm going to do it all the time.
yeah.
So it's not that we didn't do the math. I think we collectively ignored how powerful it is to play spells that progress this card and draw you more cards as you play them.
Yeah.
I mean, it's basically like, yeah, I'm going to cast these 4 spells in Aria, and also I'm going to get 3 Arclight Phoenixes back and also flip a TT, and then we're going to just do like 40 damage to you.
Everything I'm doing is on plan right now.
Well, I still see this card come out of Storm sideboards, and I'm fully in the camp of when Storm plays this against me, I am scared. Because as soon as Storm plays this against me, and now that I understand how easy it is to just chain spells for days, it feels like if I don't win in a turn or two, I'm pooped.
Right. And that's where those rituals come in handy, David.
Oh yeah, I forgot about where Stan was going with that.
Yeah.
I was just thinking about how we whiffed on it in Phoenix, but it's definitely still around in Storm. And you know what? I bet there's another deck someday in the future that this card is the main win con main board.
Somehow I'm
But
gonna
we'll see.
make it all right.
I'm glad I don't know what that is.
Yeah, that sounded like Pearl Jam. I don't know.
So here's a card.
I love cards.
Wrenn and Six.
I don't love that card, though.
Oh, no, I don't love that card.
What's not to love? It's just a red and a green for a 3 loyalty planeswalker. It's got +1, return up to 1 target land card from your graveyard to your hand.
good.
-1, Wrenn and Six deals only 1 damage to any target.
I mean, that's like, it's less than 2.
Finally, -7, you get an emblem with instant or sorcery cards in your graveyard have retrace, meaning you may cast instant and sorcery cards from your graveyard by discarding a land in addition to playing their other costs.
So none of us hated this card.
Yeah.
We all gave it believes and sleeves, but I think we need to talk a little bit about why the reviews we had for it were kind of tepid. Like it was very just kind of like, this card is cool. It's 2 mana. Okay. Because considering that this is the most expensive card in Modern Horizons now, and
Yikes.
our reviews sounded like, I think this does enough at a cheap cost to see play. The minus tags mana dorks. The plus gets back interesting lands.
Yeah.
It might not do enough in the end.
It feels like we all were really hedging our bets on this one.
I-
Yeah,
I wasn't
exactly.
I wasn't
Don't
gonna say
directly
who said
quote
that.
me. You can get the summation of me on here, but do not directly quote my words.
Mine says, I think it's a maybe. Cheap, value, cool. And Stan's says, as I've said, I like the prospects for RG Assault Loam.
Yeah, because Stan was standing Assault Loam
at
so
the time,
hardcore.
yeah.
I gave it a sleeve at least. At least I gave it a sleeve.
Yeah.
You did.
No, I mean, I did too. And what's funny is, like, I even identified what it's doing. Like, yeah, it's like it's,
Humble
it's
brag,
killing,
but okay.
It's killing cheap things. It's getting back interesting lands, but like it might not do enough. I mean, if I really looked at that, I could have been, it's a 2 mana planeswalker that gets out of bolt range,
Yeah.
like immediately.
Yeah, it
Yeah.
sure does.
Do you think that this card revitalized Jund by itself?
I think there's a
No.
strong case for it.
I think that Wrenn and Six is not the base of the mountain, but a good mid-body for Jund. Not the peak.
We talked about how in our Jund episode, even I think how there were like 6 new cards added to Jund from Horizons.
Like
I think this was
Engineer?
just one of them.
But how many are there?
Season
are still there
Pyromancer.
now?
Collecting oof?
All of them.
Well, season Pyromancer isn't necessarily.
Yeah, I mean it's just an option.
But I think Wrenn and Six is so strong that assuming, or let's say, for instance, none of those other cards were in the set, it still would have been a
Yep.
shoo-in for Jund and probably still would have had a really big impact on that deck. Obviously, we
Probably.
can't really predict that in a vacuum, but I don't know, try a Jund deck without any of the other Modern Horizons cards, and I think you'll be pretty impressed with what Wrenn and Six can do in this format.
It definitely took a few games of me having an opponent play this on turn 2, then get back a fetch land repeatedly for me to realize how good this was, and then my opponent would have perfect mana, and then could play something like Scavenging Ooze and be able to activate it 3 times the turn they play it because they have perfect mana when they play it, I'm not upset.
Yeah, I think it's mostly in that it turned out to be, I'm going to use this to draw cards. And I mean, a lot of people say this is like the fixed Deathrite Shaman.
Sure, I'll believe that.
For Modern, and I guess it kind of fits in that role in a lot of ways, so I kind of get it. I mean, the other thing that's been really interesting for me with Wrenn and Six is just people trying to jam it in other decks, not just Junt, like there's Teamer Planeswalkers, and then we talk about a Naya Stoneblade deck in a recent episode, and it's like, that was in there too. It's really wild. So sorry about that one.
If I were to put a bow on this card, and I think the failure I made is that when evaluating Modern Horizons, I didn't really consider powerful strategies that had been outclassed in the past. And consider the fact that they can have resurgence again in the future. So the impact of this card on Jund was lost on me, perhaps on some level because I don't play Jund or Rock, but also because at the time I kind of just assumed Rock had become the de facto black-green X mid-range strategy and sort of just assumed that was going to be the case moving forward. I had a similar thought when Stoneforge Mystic was unbanned and Jeskai started popping up again there, including in the highest levels of play, and ultimately seeing Wrenn and Six's impact on the format and that deck is kind of a future reminder to me to look at the old sometimes instead of immediately considering the new.
So a card that we were maybe a little excited for that failed to pan out, at least at this current point in time, which is October 21st, 2019. Marit, Lage of Slumber, which is 1 and a blue, legendary snow enchantment. Whenever it or another snow permanent enters the battlefield under your control, why don't you scry 1? At the beginning of your upkeep, if you control 10 or more snow permanents, you sacrifice Marit, Lage of Slumber. Then if you do, you create Marit Lage, a legendary 20/20 black avatar creature token with flying and indestructible.
That's a big token.
And you can't destroy it, apparently. We all give this card Believes, but it's not showing up anywhere. And there are Bant or blue-based snow decks that are showing and putting up results, but they're not running this card. So I think maybe we were a little optimistic or bright-eyed about what this card could do, and maybe 10 permanents is just too many. And honestly, even if your deck is dedicated to doing that, it's hard to do that by turn 3 consistently, and even 4. And when you're doing that, you're running sort of stranger offbeat cards because they're snow. So I think just sort of right now, maybe there's not the snow payoff, and we thought there would be, but this card just isn't where it needs to be at the current moment.
Yeah, I think that's the real point, right? Is like, you look at this card and you're like, well, 10 sounds reasonable. I made Ascend, when I was playing Limited, and that seemed reasonable. But I think there's just not enough there's not a high enough concentration of snow permanents that can really make a real deck around this card yet. And I think that's kind of, when you see an enabler like this, or a payoff rather like this, you kind of get a little starry-eyed, and you're like, okay, like this seems like a cool combo-y type finish or a cool payoff for my snow deck, but then you're like, well, what's in my snow deck?
Yeah, exactly.
Coatls and lands and Arcum's Astrolabe, and even that's not enough.
Right.
No.
Well, the whole thing is because you can't get them out fast enough for this to be truly outrageous. Like, this has to be out at on probably turn 2 or 3 to be absolutely wild, and turn 4, like I said, is like not that easy to do consistently.
Part of it for me is that I don't think it's the lack of snow permanence we're missing per se, but a lack of a cheap, effective way to make copies of snow permanence liberally. So if there was a cheap way to make extra Astrolabes or to make extra snakes or to make extra lands basically out of nothing and, kind of 2 for 1 for yourself,
right?
I think this could have some legs there. The other question I want to ask you guys, in a format with Oko the Loco, is a 20/20 indestructible even that good?
Threat level Oko.
Well, here's the thing. It doesn't have haste.
Exactly.
Yep.
Right. And so Dark Depths still see some play in Eternal formats and Legacy and stuff
Not
like that.
this one, though.
Right, but I just mean that I think that's because there are ways to protect it when your shields are down through Force of Will and stuff like that to make sure that you get the attack in, or other things. I'm not an expert in that deck. So a 20/20 is good enough to be a win condition in Legacy, so maybe it's got some moments in Modern, but also the protection is better in Legacy than it is in Modern.
Right.
So maybe it's not the right fit for a combo win condition in Modern as out of a control deck, which is essentially what this is. It's like whatever any deck you're trying to get to 10 of a type of permanence on the board is probably some kind of control deck.
So yeah, I mean, maybe in the future, if we see more snow support, we see more ways to build snow decks around this card, it might have a future. But for now, it's just not doing what we thought it would do, which would be kind of an interesting deck to build and test with. Next up, we have Sling-Gang Lieutenant. I'm guessing that Zach is wishing he had saved himself for this one rather than talking about Marit, Lage, Slumber. Sling-Gang Lieutenant, 3 and a black. Creature goblin with no job. Get a job.
No
hippie.
profession. No. What a neat.
No vocation, no career, no prospects.
Just sitting there, just being a goblin.
I thought that his job was lieutenant.
When Sling-Gang Lieutenant enters the battlefield, you create 2 1/1 red goblin creature tokens. You can sacrifice a goblin, and target player loses 1 life. You gain 1 life. So I'm just gonna pass this one over to Zach because he's the goblin boy.
So everyone but Stan was a heave on this. Even me. I was a heave on
you.
this. So what I did mention was that a future card might be able to break this open, which I feel like I should have then had to be a believe, and maybe I didn't fully understand the system at the time, and maybe I'm just a big dum-dum, but who knows? But it did happen. It happened immediately. Black-Red Goblins was a deck out of the gate right away, and it featured this card.
I think recognizing the power of a free sack ability when I first saw this card is what led me to give it a higher grade than you guys.
Yeah, and we actually talked about that in regards to Ultra Dementia.
Exactly.
Too,
right.
In the same set review.
Yep.
So I feel a little bad
Literal
that I
cards
didn't
later.
stick to that.
Right. At the same time, I mean, I was too narrow-minded about viable goblin strategies for this as well, because I wrote that it could go into 8-whack as a new type of finisher, and at the time I was sort of considering that tribes generally coalesce around the best strategy available to them, and it turned out that there's just enough goblins that you can have multiple tribal strategies.
Yeah, I think this is something that's really difficult for cards when evaluating them looking at new sets, is it's easy to look at decks that exist and things that are already real and figure where it can slot in, but it's hard to imagine what does a 2-color goblin deck look like that isn't an aggro beatdown plan? What does more of a grindy mid-range or combo goblin deck look like? And you have no idea, right? So I feel like it was definitely a faux pas on my part not to realize that a free sack outlet, like I mentioned in the Grumgully episode, is very good and very powerful, but it's hard to guess if a card like this will find a home eventually, because cards like this can have these sort of powerful, body creating sack outlet effects and actually not find a home in it.
Yeah, I think what it really gets at is like how synergy can make a card playable more than just kind of like overt power level. So when you're looking through this set, you're looking at something like Urza and you're like, duh, this is busted. This is a sleeve.
Seems good.
But you overlook a card like this because you have to sort of craft that home for it. And if you're not, an expert level brewer like the guys on Faithless Brewing or something like that, you might say, this card seems fine. Like we did, right? Like, more or less. We said it's okay. Actually, we said it was a heave because we didn't identify the home for it.
Yeah, I mean, I thought it was limited trash.
Yeah.
It's a four mana, good way to kill somebody in your Goblin's draft deck.
Yeah.
So you hate it. I say maybe one day it can be used. Stan says one day, but soon. So we have the full range of questionable takes on it.
Yeah. I mean, I definitely thought it was good in limited. When I say limited trash, I mostly mean it's only good in draft. Yeah. I mean, it's clearly an awesome card in
My
draft.
apologies,
But
yeah. I misspoke.
Giver Runes. Giver Runes is one white for a 1/2, and it's a core, and you can tap it to give another creature protection from any color or colorless.
Nice.
Until end of turn.
I've definitely lost the game because of the colorless part.
I
Where I
mean-
brought a Walking Ballista and tried to ping something, and they went, okay, Giver of Runes? And I was like, no, I gotcha. And they went, no, you don't. And it was a bad moment. Yes.
Whoops.
Can't you take off another counter on the ballista in response to the
Well, not
Giver
if you
Runes
play
ability?
it for 1 because you think you're a Galaxy Brain boy and you're going to blow them out of the water, and instead you just decided to go 0-3 that night.
It's also a 1/2, so that wouldn't have killed it any.
This is the other card.
Anyway.
So, I mean, what I really
got
wanted to talk about for this card is how we pretty much got it right, I think. Because 3 of us believed in the card, And again, Zach was the sleever.
I stand alone in my truth.
I think we all knew the effect would be like a powerful thing, not necessarily a 4 of staple. I think it's kind of like sneakily present in Modern. Maybe not sneakily, but it's present in Modern. There's in a recent decked up, it was at 7 different decks, right? Like I wouldn't have actually guessed that. So is this something that we correctly identified as 3 believers in a sleeve? Is this something that we should have given a sleeve? Like, should we have, when you think of Giver of Runes, what do you think about the card?
I mean, for me, I've played it in a couple of different decks. I feel like it's fine.
Yeah.
I don't feel like it's necessary or all that powerful, honestly. And maybe it's just because I'm kind of I feel like it doesn't do too much as a turn 1 play, and I'd rather be attacking. But then on the other hand, occasionally I get to protect something with it. I actually don't think I've ever had to tap it. Like when I have it out on the board, I think that nobody's ever tried to cast removal spells as a result, or they decide to kill the giver and then I don't get a chance to use it on anything. So I don't know. It hasn't been great for me, but I definitely can tell that it's a powerful card still.
Yeah, I mean, my main thing is it's not something that you start your deck with. Do you know what I mean? Like you don't say I'm going to build a Giver of Runes deck. It's a fine utility card in white based creature decks.
And I think that's what makes it so good, even as a lightning rod, is what Dave is alluding to. Because let's say you cast your turn 1 Giver and someone casts Bolt or Push or Path, whatever. That's a removal spell that they didn't get to use on whatever other important creatures you have in your deck that are so important that you're motivated to play Giver. So in some play patterns, it's almost giving your creatures that protection ability even while it's in the graveyard.
Yeah, but I got to tell you, this card is kind of a bad top deck, right?
Yeah.
Like if it's turn 4 and I pull one off the top, it's almost always not the card that I want.
It's just kind of slow. I mean, it's even slow, like you said, but if you top deck it, you have to hope to untap with it to do anything with it. I mean, I've definitely got some value from it in long games. Like a couple of them is kind of cool. They can protect each other while protecting other creatures on the board. It can create some annoying board states for your opponent and help you get damage through that you couldn't get through otherwise. But I don't think it's something. It's one of those things I just think we got right. And I think that it's just one of those cards that it's around. It's going to be there. It's the kind of card that I think more parts of Modern Horizons probably should have been, or maybe we could have hoped would have been, where it's they're not blowing things wide open. They're just nice additions to the format.
Seasoned Pyromancer is a card I would put in that same bucket, by the way.
That's what popped to mind immediately.
Up next, we've got Soulherder. 1 white-blue for a 1/1 creature spirit. Whenever a creature is exiled from the battlefield, put a 1/1 counter on Soulherder. And at the beginning of your end step, you may exile another target creature you control, then return that card to the battlefield under its owner's control. Was I the most positive about this card?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
I don't even remember what I rated it. I might have just left it blank.
I called it against the odds tier.
You just had a funny comment. It just said playing Soulherder in Modern.
I wonder what that could be a reference
That's what I
to.
put.
Yeah, that was Zach. You said
Zach.
seems okay, not crazy good. I called it a B- against the odds tier, and Stan thought it was dope.
Yeah, it is. Look,
yeah, bro.
the card is strong. Clearly, it's very narrow. And I've heard that it even sees play in Spirit sometimes too, not to mention the banned Soulherder deck that it lends its name to. I think that the fact that the effect happens every turn, coupled with all the strong ETBs available to you in Modern, it ends up being a potent threat, and that's why it turned out to be at least playable in the absolute right shells. Again, almost like Giver of Runes, this isn't just a card you slam into like other decks. It is a build around in and of itself.
I mean, is this a real deck?
I think so.
I don't really get this deck. I don't think Gabe Nassif would spend that much time playing it if it wasn't a real deck. But is this is this the real engine card? Like, is this really?
You dare doubt Gabe?
Is this the build around?
So I have played the Soulherder deck, and
Against me.
yeah, and my takeaway was that it's just like a very good finisher in that deck, because what happens is Soulherder ends up being a 5/5, and then very quickly it's a 6/6, and then sometimes in the same turn it suddenly becomes an 8/8 because you're coupling it with Ephemerate as well as its own ability, maybe even other Soulherders. So you have all these synergies within the deck that makes it so strong, but it has to be in the right deck, because otherwise it's just a 3-mana 1/1 that you're not getting any value out of, and it sits there doing nothing.
Yeah. I don't know if it's a legit deck like today, but it certainly was a month ago, like when it was all over Magic Online. Like I'm not sure if the metagame has shifted to a point where it's not as good, but I lost to it plenty of times and saw it do things like have 3 10/10 Soulherders on the board at the same time, and that's tough to tangle with.
The very first time I lost to it, I was like literally reliving flashbacks to record the episode, be going like, yes, it's skippable, or we don't need to cover it, it's whatever, and just like in black and white in my brain, like, no, as I got beat down by a bunch of 2020s.
The other thing I would say is that this card is one that has a lot of chance to improve over time, because the
high
the
ceiling
thing that it does is very simple. And so every time they print a card with a good comes into play effect, you're going to be like, can I pair that with Soulherder and Modern and kind of like do it every turn? Will that be good?
So, moving from a card that we were a little unsure of that ended up being playable, we're going to talk about a card that we thought was a shoo-in that ended up being relegated to the sidelines. And it's Flusterstorm. 1 blue for an instant, counter target instant or sorcery spell, unless its controller pays 1 generic mana. Then it has this thing called Storm.
Never heard of it.
When you cast the spell, copy it for each spell cast before it this turn. You can choose new targets for the copies. So what this turns into is a counterspell that is really good in counterspell wars, is good at stopping storm decks, is good in storm decks, etc. And we thought this is going to be just really good in Modern, right? Like we said, it's 1 mana, it fits in a lot of different places, it's a really good utility spell, but it's nowhere.
Yeah, I mean, we gave it a few sleeves. I pre-ordered 2 as soon as I saw it spoiled as the buy-a-box. This card has just basically never really seen play. I think there's just not enough decks that put a ton of spells on the stack, right? I mean, besides Storm, I think Spell Pierce, which is in Modern itself just a useful but not ubiquitous counter spell, is just going to be better most of the time because it makes them pay 2 generic.
I think it's tough. Like I think there are actually a lot of decks that cast a lot of spells, right? There's just not maybe that many decks that you really care about getting the last spell on the stack off against it. So like if you imagine playing against Urza, for example, and Urza's like, I'm going to play 4 0 casting cost artifacts and Arcum's Astrolabe this turn, then I'm going to try to cast Paradoxical Outcome, and you're like, Flusterstorm. They don't want to lose Paradoxical Outcome, but at the same time, you probably could have had a different counterspell that was more effective in that situation. So, Mono Red Prowess is the same thing, for example. Like, not that deck is as hot now as it was a couple months ago, but you'll cast 4 or 5 spells in a turn, but like, what spell do you want to counter with this? So it really comes down to, you want this as a safety valve for decks that try to storm off so that you can have an anti-storm card, and then that gets really weird.
Yeah, you just don't play to the stack like you do in Legacy, where Flusterstorm is very useful.
So I hear you guys talking about using this against Storm, but to me, to this day, I mostly see it as another card that can be played in Storm to improve some of its mid-range and control matchups. And for instance, over the weekend, I was playing against Storm, and they cast Mystical Dispute against one of my spells, and I feel like that could be Flusterstorm and have the same effect for less mana.
It could be. I mean, Mystical Dispute is good because it can target creatures too, though, and that's the other thing about Flusterstorm, right, is that you need to bring it in against something that's cast targeting instant or sorcery, and so it gets a little bit back to what Shane was saying, which is just like you don't play on the stack as much in Modern as you do in Legacy. So I think it's tough because it's this crossroad between negate and spell pierce and force of negation are good, and then mystical dispute and other things like that are good because they add on mana leak, say for example, are kind of like good because they also nab creature spells. But this thing that's like a surgical targeted on instants and sorceries is just kind of like too narrow, I guess.
What a world where counterspell is too good, but Flusterstorm isn't good enough.
It's weird. It's just not the right fit. Like maybe someday there'll be something. I think it's important to have as a safety valve.
Yeah, I think maybe one of the takeaways for me is that even though we can't play with OG Counterspell, the counters in Modern are pretty excellent. And you have so many to choose from that have so many different, very relevant and realistic outlets that you don't necessarily need to jam something like Flusterstorm because you have access to all these other options that might interact with the format or the meta much more effectively.
Force negation in the set. Free, kind of.
All right, next up.
This card.
Yeah, next up we have Crashing Footfalls. Strangely, there's no casting cost. There's only suspend
there's
4.
no symbols there at all.
Suspend 4.
It's just blank.
For a green. So suspend is rather than cast this card from your hand, you just pay a green. You exile it with 4 time counters on it. At the beginning of your upkeep, remove a time counter. When the last is removed, you cast it without paying its mana cost, which is funny because it has no mana cost. So what it does is it creates 2 4/4 green rhino creature tokens with trample. All right, so we thought this would be interesting if we cast it for free, right? I think that's something a number of us mentioned. Casting a suspend card for free can be good enough for something to see play, right? And I think at least I overlooked that there were more ways to cast those suspend cards for free than I anticipated. So, the free nature, the free casting of Crashing Footfalls has made it at least playable, like in a fringe type strategy to exist. And I think that we just kind of forgot about that method of casting this was there, and it didn't have to be like rhinos attacking on turn 6.
Right, yeah. I sort of see it as a failure to recognize the ceiling on this card.
Yeah.
And likewise, not really considering some existing synergies that were already in Modern, such as one that I always hate when it's cast against me is Finale of Promise targeting this. And all of a sudden, opponent casts 2 spells and made 4/4 trampling.
Seems good.
So
I worried that this was like a meme card, I think, and it turned out to be one of the best payoffs for the As Foretold Electrodominance core. And that is a surprise because I kind of thought Restore Balance would be the best.
Yeah, I think, honestly, the creature type being a 4/4, which is kind of weird, and Rhino, which is like not a supported tribe or barely recognized in Magic, it sort of feels a little goofy, right? It feels a little time spiral-y and like, oh, this is some reference to a card I don't understand. Let's move on and continue it. But like Shane said, there are all these ways to activate it there. It's like Cascade is okay. Like you can have a Living End deck with this in it, and it's not a bad card in that deck as long as you plan it right and build the deck in the right way. And just sort of, I think we were, for this one, like Stan said, didn't recognize the ceiling and were a little too narrow-minded in order to focus in on the really raw power of this card.
Yeah, we focused on the floor and not the ceiling.
Yeah, exactly.
Like Stan said. And I think that, that's a flaw when we're here, we want to not be necessarily wrong. We want to kind of be critical rather than kind of put our brewer hats on. And sometimes it pays to wear that hat. It's a funny looking hat sometimes, but gets the job done.
They don't make it in my size.
Do they have it in 7 5/8?
That's my hat size too, Dave.
That's my hat size too. Yeah.
Oh my goodness! I don't talk about my hat size.
4.
What kind of people know their hat size?
Because you buy that sick fitted, bro.
You never bought yourself a fine hat?
You've never like waited for a drop at like 4 a.m. for like a Japanese website to drop the hat in the size you need that you bought with your parents' credit card because your mom was asleep?
You've never had a 5950?
My answer to all of your questions is no.
You sound a little upset.
Stan wears elastic snapbacks.
I had the unfortunate experience of going into a Gorin Brothers one time and coming out $1,000 in debt with 15 hats and not.
What are you even talking about right now?
And not quite understanding my new lifestyle.
The thing is, I only wear Stanzo brand hats because they're nice.
That's a good
they are nice. They're nice.
That's a good one. You got to buy all of them or it's not really worth it for me.
All right, the next card we're going to talk about is Tribute Mage, which was 2 and a blue for some power and toughness. I don't even remember what its stats are. Who cares?
It's a 1/2. That's important.
It's a 1/2. Okay. It's a human wizard. When Tribute Mage enters the battlefield, you may search your library for an artifact card with converted mana cost 2. Reveal that card, put it into your hand, then shuffle your library. So this is the card that everybody thought had a chance to be used to search up pieces of the Thopter Sword combo.
Yeah, this was us seeing the ceiling.
Yes. Well, I think we also saw the ceiling, and we also didn't see that there were better tools that did the same thing.
Yeah.
or more versatile tools that did the same thing. We let the actual picture, kind of deceive us a little bit because it does have a picture of someone holding Sword of Meek. But it turns out since Goblin Engineer is in this set, it has more synergy with the deck that ended up wanting to play Goblin Engineer, which is Wurza.
So yeah, we were all believers on this card, right? But I was like a hard sleeve on it. Like I thought it was going to be a major player, like in a Sword of the Meek combo deck, because like you said, it just looks designed to tutor that up, and I think you mentioned in your reviews, like it tutors up all sorts of other potential utility cards for the value as well. This card's just straight up nowhere.
Yeah, and even in the art, it's holding the Sword of the Meek. Like you mentioned in the review, Shane, it's just they couldn't be more on the nose about what this card is for. But it was just outclassed sort of in the decks that wanted it by Goblin Engineer, because you could get the sword because you wanted it in the graveyard to trigger the combo, right? So you can tutor it up, but as a failsafe, you can get other cards too, and it has utility beyond the turn comes into play, where you can keep moving cards around and have this added bonus. So sort of, I think that maybe it could see play eventually, and that it does have a lot of raw power, but where we envisioned it, there was just a better contender, and it wasn't going to be played there.
I don't really have much else to add. Maybe this is a card we can lean back on if a very powerful 2-mana artifact gets printed that you want to tutor up. And
in a mono blue deck.
That you want to play main deck even.
Yeah.
I guess Bluetron, here we go.
Yeah, you know how decks like this are tutoring up cards by putting them in their graveyard off of their Emeries.
Yes. Oh, now it's even worse, right? Now they're playing Emery for sure.
Goblin Engineer has been replaced by Emery, literally instantly.
Next card was a consolation prize for all the blue mages that couldn't get original counterspell, even though we wanted it. And that is Archmage's Charm. Blue, blue, blue. 3 modes: counter target spell, or target player draws 2 cards, or gain control of target non-land permanent with CMC 1 or less.
I think the big thing here is that, I gave it a sleeve, Stan gave it a sleeve. It's in one deck. I mean, I think Stan's assessment was better than mine in the sense that I thought it was going to be played in a lot of decks. But I've never even cast one of these as it turned out. And I don't think there's that many decks that are able to run this and Cryptic Command. And so I just end up running Cryptic Command in the decks that I play.
Dave, wasn't this card responsible for one of your worst specs from Modern Horizons?
Well, I mean, I didn't spec. I bought it. I pre-ordered it for myself. But I did pay $10 a piece for these or something like that. And they're only $2 or I don't remember what the pre-order price was. But I mean, I think I just thought that this would replace Hieroglyphic Illumination in some of the decks that were running that, just to have an extra counter spell, an extra modal that draws 2 cards. And it turns out that at the time, people weren't running that anymore. And then with the unbanning of Stoneforge Mystic, there isn't even room in the blue-white decks anymore to be able to run Hieroglyphic Illumination anyway. So still pretty interesting, I think. So I think that, I was too optimistic about it fitting in a lot of decks, and I know that Shane kind of was down on it anyway,
So yeah, I mean, I feel pretty vindicated in my assessment, right? So the triple blue is just super brutal for anything. It's not just obscenely blue, like 22 blue sources blue if you want to be casting it on turn 3. I mean, of course you can cast it after turn 3, but it's kind of off the power level of the card. The individual components of the card are kind of below rate already, but casting it later than turn 3, maybe it's going to be useful, but broadly you want to be casting your cards on curve, right? So blue-white control runs something like high teens for the blue sources. So unless you're something like Blue Moon, and I know Stan loves that deck, you're not really running this card very often.
So we touched on this very briefly in a previous episode, and I think the tricky thing for blue-white are all the Field of Ruins, which is what makes it so hard to do it on turn 3. And you don't really always have very clean mana early on when, let's say, you want to cast this on curve. Yeah, I mean, that being said, in my review, I specifically called out that this card is going into Blue Moon, or at the very least was very testable in Blue Moon. And like Shane, I too feel vindicated.
So can I ask, do you think that basically that this card could go in any blue deck that is running a ton of blue and wants counter spells, basically? Is that the only bar? Is it powerful enough for Modern and it's just that you need to be able to cast it reliably, or?
I think it needs to be in a control shell where you're keeping mana up. And I think it needs to be in a deck where you used to hold up Cryptic Command and Illumination, and now you just combine that on one card.
Yeah. Because I noticed that, like, the Pen Sword, he posted a list the other day, and I think it was 3 Cryptics and 2 Archmage Charms, or 3 and 3 or something like that. So definitely loading up on these, like, modal counter spells is something that deck has decided to do, and maybe it's just any blue-based control deck. That's where you're going.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, it needs to have a high blue count. I don't think it can run Field of Ruin.
Yeah.
Moving on, we have Planebound Accomplice, 2 and a red, creature, human, wizard. Activate ability for a single red. You may put a Planeswalker card from your hand onto the battlefield, then sacrifice at the beginning of the next end step. So we were pretty hot on this card for the most part. We thought that it would allow some sort of shenanigans or open up some combo in Modern, and it hasn't done that yet. I think it has potential to. I think my belief is correct, and that this is something that is definitely believable and can one day do something. But right now, there's just not a walker that's worth putting all these resources into to get one activation. Even something like Chandra, Awakened Inferno, a card I'm really hyped on, you don't want to play her and then only get one tick. The whole thing is she's going to stick around ideally and provide a lot of incremental value.
Yeah, even in like the Saheeli combo deck where you think, okay, maybe this like provides some redundancy for like getting that Saheeli on the board. Like, if you have, it doesn't like tutor it up. You still have to have it in your hand. Like, so if you're going to play it, you're just going to play Saheeli. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And that's 3 mana. So you're saving 2 mana on it and it dies right away.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like this is a card that's just going to sit there for a while, and then someday there'll be a 12 CMC Planeswalker with an incredible minus on it that people are going to want to do, and then we're going to have some weirdness with that kind of deck, but that theoretical deck doesn't even sound good, so.
Yeah, it takes some sort of Eldrazi Titan-esque Planeswalker that you have to get in early for this to be worth it, and I think maybe that Planeswalkers are good, but they're good because they provide the incremental value, right? And a Planeswalker coming down and doing one thing maybe is not as good as we thought it would be, or not as good yet as we want it to be.
It's fair.
I agree with everything y'all are saying, but if I were to reevaluate this card today, and I'm much colder on it than I was a couple months ago, I think the card being 3 CMC plus an extra mana to activate it is what ultimately makes it too expensive and thus probably unplayable in Modern. Because if there's a combo that wants to try this, I just sense that there's better ways to spend 4 mana to enable a combo.
Sure.
Probably true.
Moving on, Cabal Therapist, the last rare that I got in the last Modern Horizons pack I ever opened. True story, I even held on to it. It's a creature that cost a single B for black. It's got Menace. It's a 1/1. Is that correct? Okay.
Yeah.
At the beginning of your pre-combat main phase, you may sacrifice a creature. When you do, choose a non-land card name. Then, target player reveals their hand and discards all cards with that name. And if you may recall, this was the first card next to Serra Ascendant that they announced with the release of Modern Horizons. So this is just kind of our sneak peek into this set.
And we did say that because they showed it right away, or I said this, because they showed it right away, surely they believe must be powerful. And surely we must be overlooking something or not seeing some sort of hidden interaction.
And please stop calling me Shirley.
And they even called it like this is one of the top 10 most powerful cards in the set.
Yeah, like Matt Nass and Cass were like had a great reaction shot to it, and looking at it now, it's like this is top 10 most powerful. Come on.
I mean, we all thought it was like interesting, like we gave it believes, and I think even like a sleep, but we identified the general weakness of the card, and then it's just too slow. Like at the beginning of your pre-combat main phase, so like you can't even use it to like the beginning of your second turn, and then you couldn't even have cast like a Thoughtseize or an Inquisition to have seen their hand before you're doing that. So like the first turn you're really able to use it powerfully is like on turn 3.
So one of the tensions that I think I've assessed since this card has been around is that it kind of wants to be in a deck with both creatures and other discard effects. Right. To me, like I look at a card like this as something that pairs really nicely with Thoughtseize or Inquisition of Kozilek, but also wants to ideally capitalize on death triggers. And when you're devoting slots to attention point, at least its attention point today, you're not doing either of those effects particularly well.
It's just too much setup. Like, it's just too much setup for like not enough payoff. You have to have a certain number of cards in your hand to like really get value from it. You have to have creatures on the board, hopefully not just it. So it's just like, what are you doing with this card, and is the payoff really there?
And I sort of have a bonus point here, where Modern is such a wide open format, and pros complain about that, and so many decks are really viable, that going in blind, you can't really name a card reliably with this, and it's really hard to work. And like even something like Chalice on 1 or 2 can be a big gamble, and like not knowing what's going to work out, but naming a specific card, Modern has so many playable decks, like the other category is the biggest all the time, right?
So here's my take, because I actually still have some hopes and some lingering beliefs.
Would you call them dreams?
Maybe. And I wonder if we're perhaps looking at this card from the wrong direction. And the thought that had crossed my mind
West or south?
Well, maybe it's east, because I wonder if maybe this will end up in a deck where you're targeting yourself.
Whoa.
Where you're targeting
Okay.
yourself to force yourself to discard a bunch of cards, such as Arclight Phoenix or something else for Unearth.
It's pretty heavy.
Mic drop.
In a deck like redundant with Merchant, like you run 4 of these and 4 Merchant in the Veil, because those are the best enablers that there are right now for Skelemental. I mean,
Let's go.
it's certainly a different way to use it,
Sure.
and that you have way more control over. So could be.
God, I love getting some unanimous woes
Yeah,
from my co-hosts. That's when I know I'm secretly the smart one.
it's true.
Wait, what?
Secretly?
It's not a secret
Smart
anymore,
one?
Stan. All right, Shane, take us out. Let's get the last card.
All right. Last card we'll talk about in this bonus episode is one of the ones that I was high on. We all were high on. It's Unsettled Mariner. White and a blue for a creature shapeshifter 2/2 changeling. This card is every creature type. Whenever you or a permanent you control becomes a target of a spell or ability an opponent controls, counter that spell or ability unless its controller pays 1 generic mana. We were all so high on this card. And ultimately I think it's just kind of fine. Like it's, it comes in and out of decks. It's not really a staple anywhere that I know of. You might see 2 or so sprinkled into like blue-white spirits or 5-color humans. I think when you're just comparing this with something like Thalia, it just, which presents like a universal taxing effect, it might just not be good enough. Like you combine that with the blue-white versus just the white, the casting cost, it presents that the deck building restrictions on top of it. So it's just like maybe not doing enough, even though it seems like it's doing so much.
I just feel like decks like this are just jam-packed with cards.
Yes.
And so having room for a redundant like protection effect like this has just turned out to not be worth it. And that's hand in hand a little bit with the fact that this style of deck is a little bit on the wane at moment. Your spirits, your humans are a little bit smaller in meta share, so there might not be that much innovation going on in the deck list right now. So we'll see. It feels like it's still a powerful card, but maybe it's just not the right time, and maybe it's never going to be a 4 of.
I agree. It still feels like a powerful card, and it almost feels like extra copies of Thalia, even though what it's doing is fundamentally different. I like the idea of being able to have multiple Thalias on the board. So when you have that and this out at the same time for mid-range or control players who are casting a lot of targeted spells, that's a big problem that you have to overcome.
Yeah, I feel like it's hard in some ways too, though, because isn't Kira Great Glass Spinner just kind of better than this card sometimes, or no?
I mean, it can be. It has a higher CMC, but then without the blue and the white restrictions. So, I mean, there's certain things there. I mean, that's why it was running Merfolk, for instance. Kira was.
But it's always a 2-for-1.
Yes, that's the advantage, right? Is like Kira really does a lot in terms of the kind of just the raw card value. Whereas when I play Unsettled Mariner, like a lot of times it's not doing anything besides like maybe taxing a single spell, and I didn't really get much value out of it at all. And I think something like Thalia, even though that frequently does happen with that play pattern, what the taxing effect being on non-creature spells is just so powerful in shutting down a myriad of strategies, whereas that's not always the case with Unsettled Mariner.
I think that's great. Too optimistic on that last one.
So until next week, be less optimistic.
So after we wrap up this card reevaluation, I think we just want to stop for a second and ask what our takeaways are from doing this kind of reevaluation. And what I learned this one, or was reminded of, is pay attention to reduction in casting cost on cards that might seem innocuous. So a card that goes from 2 to 1, that's the big thing that really matters. Generally, if it has a powerful effect, if it happens to draw a card, you should definitely pay attention to it and really question yourself to see if it has a home somewhere.
Yeah, the big one for me is to start looking at old houses and not just looking for new homes. And I think part of that has to do with my own tendency and the tendency of modern players to kind of look for the next big thing, the next new thing. But something that Wrenn and Six and other cards that have emerged since then have kind of revealed to me is seeing old strategies that used to be very strong get updates in their colors might be enough to bring something back because it was good enough then for a reason.
Yeah, I'm going to use yours, Stan, which is look at a card's ceiling rather than focus on the floor. Because I think oftentimes the ceiling can be high enough that it's worth running a card in a shell that might be, not necessarily tier 1, but certainly shows up in, every deck dump.
Right. I think there's a sort of heuristic where it's evaluating a card by its ceiling is bad, but that is only because sometimes the ceiling is not reachable very often or hard to get to. So if the card's ceiling is actually something you can do consistently or pretty easily, maybe it's worth taking that ceiling into consideration more often.
Yeah, just look at the room. Like maybe it's not the floor or the ceiling. It's just the room it's in most of the time.
You're tearing me apart, Shane.
Oh, hi.
This is why I always carry a tape measure so I can get some dimensions on the walls. Friends, another bonus episode in the bag. Wouldn't be October without one.
Contractually obligated.
Trick or treat, I put a bonus episode in your bag.
That doesn't rhyme at all.
That wraps up this week's show. Thanks again to our patrons who made this possible. If you haven't yet, make sure you subscribe to our podcast so you get the latest episodes as soon as they come out. And if you use Apple Podcasts, please leave us a rating and review. If you'd like to submit a question to the podcast or pick our brain on something in Modern, you can tweet us at thedivedown, all one word. You can email us, thedivedown@gmail.com. Heck, you can even keep in touch with us on Instagram at instagram.com/thedivedown, all one word there as well. If you'd like to support the show, you can join our Patreon, where joining at any tier gets you access to our super secret Slack channel. If you go up a tier, you can get some tokens. If you go up a tier, you can get some foil dive down copies signed by the co-hosts.
Some playmats.
Speculate now.
We got playmats. We've got keg taps in the works.
I understand we have temporary tattoos as well.
Yeah, and they are life size, and they're all our faces.
Wait, what?
Full back piece. Yeah.
Also, you can support the show by signing up for manatraders.com, where you get to rent cards for Magic Online or in paper, whether you play Modern, whether you're testing out Frontier, Standard.
Whether you're a pioneer on the new frontier.
Listen, I'm going to call Pioneer Frontier by accident, I think, forever. So I'm apologizing in advance, both to my co-hosts and the listeners. Please keep correcting me. I will try to improve, but it's like a mental block that I can't seem to get over. Really, the lesson there is don't forget manatraders.com just because I misspoke while talking about it. Use coupon code thedivedown, all one word, to get 10% off your first 3 months of ManaTrader service. As always, special thanks to the bands Nowhere and Spaceblood for letting us use their music.
And until next week, get out there and scrutinize Modern Horizons!
Is just so brutal for anything that's not obscenely blue, like 22 blue sources blue if you want to be casting this on turn 3.
Is that Derby?
Yeah, it's Derby.
Well, because he's been in that recording the
I
entire time.
know.
then.
Derby, come here, bud. Come here.
Sit on Papa's lap.
Your eyes look terrifying when you do that, Stan.
Come here,
All right.
kitten.
I don't love it.
So, I'll again mention that like blue-white control runs something like
He was good the whole episode up until now.